When I first started writing scientific papers, I thought that when you write the method, you write it step by step. And this was because every time, like in school, every time we wrote, a scientific method, we had apparatus and then aim, hypothesis, apparatus, and then the method, and that would be number one, do this, number two, do that. And I didn't know that it was different until, I looked at other papers and my teacher kind of clarified it for me. And so I realized that it's really different. When you write the method, it gets really complicated. So today we're going to look at how you can write the method. So this is how you write the methodology. Okay, firstly, let's look at a few key points. Chronological order. Okay, what you want to do is that you want to always write your method in chronological order. Firstly, you don't want to use number one, this happened first, number two, this happened first. It should not be a step-by-step protocol. Rather, it should be written somewhat as a recount. So first of all, don't write it, number one, we did this, number two, we did that. That's not how it's done. You want to write it as a recount of this is what I did first, then this is what I did, then this, no, not that. You want to do this was done first, followed by this, after this, blah blah blah. Okay, I hope that's clear. Now, first key point, always write in chronological order. So we have two examples here. The red one, cell growth was stopped with hydrochloric acid after incubation for 65 to 70 hours at 37 degrees. Now, if someone was skimming this paper, they'd pick up the keywords. They'd think cell growth stopped with hydrochloric acid, and then it was incubated for 65 to 70 hours at 37 degrees. So they think that cell growth that was stopped and afterwards it was incubated. However, that's not what happened. So when you write your method, you want to make sure that you have it in chronological order as much as possible. So the green example, after the incubation of cells for 65 to 70 hours at 37 degrees, their growth was stopped with hydrochloric acid. Now, if someone's, skimming that paper, they're going to understand everything because they're going to pick up the keywords and they're still going to be right. So first of all, make sure that it's in chronological order. Secondly, you want to make generic statements because imagine you're at a museum. You're not gonna, as soon as you see a painting, as soon as you see the Mona Lisa, you're not gonna talk about the texture of the paint and the color of the dress and the color of the hair. No, you're gonna look at the painting in its whole, and afterwards, after you've looked at the painting, you're gonna look at the texture of the paint, the color of the hair, the color choice for the clothes. You're not gonna start by looking at those things. And similarly, when you want to look at your method, you want to start by making generic statements. And so when you offer a general view and when you outline the parameters of work, what you're doing is that you're creating this, similar to how you did with the introduction, you're creating this very large, space, and this is where the reader can, easily grasp. And once they've grasped onto those pieces of information, they'll slowly look at the details. So let's say you used a pendulum that you modified in some way. At first, you wouldn't start with a modified this pendulum was blah 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 was used for this. You'd say a pendulum was used for this. And then in the second sentence, you talk about how the pendulum was modified. So when you make generic statements, your reader feels that it's really easy to grasp on, and then you can easily lead them into more specific statements. So how can you actually start your method? So you can offer general views by discussing parameters. Then you want to provide information about the source of the materials, equipment, etc. So if you collected, samples from a dam, you can say dam samples were collected from here, because that's where most scientific researchers have collected them from, blah blah blah. Or you can refer back to something before in the paper, like the aim. So to address the aim, the method was modified, something like that, Next, key points. So now we've looked at that first set of key points. Okay, now when you talk about, your method, you have to include background information, because you know you don't know how much your reader knows about your topic. So there's two things I want you to consider when you're talking about your method. If you go straight into, let's say it's a very basic paper and you're talking about radiation, and you say this many hertz of radiation, blah blah blah, but the paper, this paper, that's the target audience that this paper is targeted towards, they don't even know what radiation means. So what should you do? First of all, you should kind of define radiation. This is something you should have done in your introduction, and then you want to, let's say you use some radiation monitoring machine, you'd first want to describe that radiation monitoring machine. So you'd say, this brand radiation monitoring machine was used at this intensity, blah blah blah. So there's two things you have to consider when providing background information to ensure that you don't give too much detail and not too little detail. What can all potential readers be assumed to know about this method in general? And what do they all need to know in order to understand your specific method? So you need to find that sweet spot between them. Where can I provide background information that's not too much or too less? Okay, next, you want to explain your choices. So in your method, you probably made your own method, or you modified someone else's method from a different experiment. And it's important to state the reasons for the choices you make. You must justify them via factual information, because your reasons, the reasons why you modified a pendulum or you used this X-ray monitoring machine, something like that, are obvious to you. But the reader will question, why did they do this? Why did they do this specifically? They could have done it the other way. And so if you explain it, that kind of strengthens, that kind of creates a connection with the reader, and they're like, okay, exactly, this is why this was done. And so they feel that they're following this flow, they're absorbing ideas, going back to this key point of absorbing ideas. But if you don't explain why you made certain choices, your readers will find it hard to accept the method, and this will eventually affect the way you study. Okay. Detail in methods. Basically, always be wider and more interdisciplinary than when you think when writing about methods. It's good to include citations if your method is based on that of another researcher, but also explain it in your own words. So you want to, as I said before, you want to justify, and so you want to do this by, if you've got your research, if you've got your method from somewhere else, you want to cite them, but then you also want to say what that method is. You want to provide a general view. So you want to justify it is one of the key aspects of the method. That's that key point where your reader will make that connection, will feel as if they're absorbing ideas, because if you're able to justify, they'll feel that everything is evidence-based. Okay, now fourth, you want to use chronological words. So in most cases you're going to be like, this was done, then this was done, blah, blah, blah. But it's not gonna, it's gonna become very repetitive, and so it's going to be harder for the reader to pick up on ideas, because you're kind of breaking that flow if you're going to use the same words. It sounds very repetitive. So you want to use chronological words. So if you're talking about before the beginning, you want to say beforehand, earlier, at the beginning, at first, at the beginning, steps, order. So there's this list that you can refer to if you want, and you can also use your own words. Okay, now your weaknesses will make you look stronger. The last point. So if there's any problems in your method or limitations, it's good to include them, because you can refer to those back in your discussion and you can talk about them. That becomes a talking point for discussions. And in many cases, like if you don't have enough resources, or if you're limited, people might use that as a direction for their research. They can do your research with a more valid method, and that can shape their research, right? And another aspect is, if your problems are linked to discrepancies in the results, you're ultimately able to talk about it when that happens, and you don't have to pull it out of nowhere or say that you don't know how it happened. So your weaknesses will make you give you more points to talk about, and they will be able to progress give your paper a direction for research. They'll create this continuum, and yeah, people will be able to make further research on it. And another thing is that it also shows truthfulness. It also shows transparency, which is, something that it's not going to be that obvious when you write the paper, but people will think something is fishy if that entire paper went perfect, especially if it's, not from like a really high performing team of top scientists. Okay, so here is the generic method model. At first, you want to provide an overview of statements about the methods. Then you want to restate the aim, the gap from the introduction. And look, you can modify this as you go, because you want to modify the models based on how other papers in the field are written. Then you want to describe the give the source of materials and equipment used. In the second point, you want to provide details. And here's where you justify your choices, and here's where you indicate if you took proper care or not. Then you want to describe discuss the content of a figure or a table. So here's where you say how that experiment was, how a table was derived from your experiment. So if you're throwing a ball, you could say that motion tracking app was used. Then you want to kind of refer to materials or methods in other studies, like if you've taken one of their methods, or why did you do this. A good way to justify your choices is showing that other papers have done it as well, and people can often think if this is a common way of doing it, why not? And yeah, then you want to provide background information if necessary, and then at last you want to indicate issues or problems, because then you can talk about them in a discussion, so you're creating a flow. Now let's look at an example. Okay, this person, a method to analyze levels of dissolved CO2 in pristine groundwater. See, I took this example and I tabulated it. If you want to see the actual example and stuff, look at Science Research Writing 2nd edition. But yeah, here's table version. Okay, at first they provide an overview of the method, the current investigation. Then they provide background information. This region in the Midwestern United States, and look, as they say, they justify and they cite. Wells in this area, look at 2, and then look at section 2 and the first sentence in that. Wells in this area have been frequently used to interpret groundwater evolution. And so that's good justification. You're justifying your choices. And then you're going to state the numbers. Here's where you use numericals, 18 3 milliliter samples, and then prior to collection. See, that's a chronological word. That's a time word. That's when you're saying that this happened before this, and that's a key, part of that key list I gave you. And then you want pH levels were monitored, and then you want to describe what was done in detail. So now you're kind of bringing them in. That's the blue section. The sample bottles were transferred to amber glass bottles, which are sealed tightly, blah blah blah. And then you want to provide more details. So kind of this model, is adjusted to the field it's in. And so that's something you want to do. Here they flipped 4 with 3, and then they have 3 samples were shipped directly to 2 separate. And then 5. This method uses a carbon analyzer, blah blah blah. Provide this. Now they're providing more information. And then 6, they mention a limitation. All filters used for glass or stainless steel, all the 2 samples were at risk of CFC contamination. So now, let's say I'm reading this paper and I'm like, oh, what happens if there was a risk of CFC contamination? What happens if those 2 samples were contaminated and they mucked up the entire data? Oh look, I've just got, a new way of research. I can redo their experiment with much better equipment, and I can say, hey look, if there is a change, and that could be my scientific paper. Yeah? Okay, and see, this is how you write the method. And so this is, the generic method model. In the next video, we're going to look at how to present your results. And so, yeah, this is how you write the method, and I hope you enjoyed this video. And yeah, till then, keep grinding. Bye bye.